Week 13 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I looked at off the wire this week. The first guy, Mike White, of the New York Jets. So the Jets here, it's been a carousel of quarterbacks this season. First with Joe Flacco, then Zach Wilson, who's been a disaster, their early round pick last season. And now Mike White, he started in their Week 12 ball game. What a great ball game, no doubt about it. 315 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 rush yards, even though it was versus a weak Chicago Bear defense. So right here, Week 13, a decent matchup at the Minnesota Vikings. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. But right here, I'm going to limit the expectations for Mike White. 30 fantasy points in the victory versus the Chicago Bears. But that was the Bear team that's pretty much finished this season. But right now, you got Minnesota and Buffalo coming up. Not the greatest of matchups, but available right now in White in 96% of fantasy leagues. And he's a quarterback I would give an opportunity to this week. The next guy, Marcus Mariota of the Atlanta Falcons. So Mariota, he keeps finding his way on this list because of matchup-based type of games he has coming up. Even though he's not been delivering big ball games, he's still been serviceable, is Mariota. Over the last 3 games here for him, Week 10 at Carolina, 186 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, and 43 rush yards. Week 11 versus the Bears, 131 pass yards, a touchdown, 25 rushing, and a rushing touchdown. And Week 12 at Washington, 174 pass yards, a touchdown with an interception in the end zone to end the ball game with 50 rushing yards. So right here, Week 13, a good matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers that give up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. And right here, Mariota, better quarterback at home in the Dome in Atlanta than he is on the road. So right here, as a streaming option, I think he's a decent add off the wire this week. And he's available right now in 62% of fantasy leagues. The next guy is Deshaun Watson of the Cleveland Browns. So Deshaun Watson making his triumphant return to the Brown lineup after being suspended pretty much for a year and a half here after getting a big deal and traded from Houston to the Browns. Why would it be anything different than him making his season debut at the Houston Texans, obviously his former team, in Week 13. So Deshaun Watson, we know he's a great athlete. We know he's got pretty good weapons over here in Cleveland with Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt in the backfield, David Njoku with tight end, and then 2 good receivers in Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones. So right here, he's got good weapons. He's got a good matchup. I know we haven't seen him, like I said, in a year and a half here, is Deshaun Watson. But if he has a big blow-up game, this guy's going to be added pretty much universally and owned. And right now, he's still available in 42% of fantasy leagues. The next guy's Jared Goff for the Detroit Lions. Jared Goff this season, he's been a serviceable fantasy quarterback on matchups. And obviously, when he plays at home, better than he is on the road. And guess what? Another home game in Week 13 for Jared Goff. So the last few games here for him, Week 10 at Chicago, 236 pass yards, a touchdown, 14 rushing. Week 11 at the Giants, 165 pass yards in that one. And then Week 12 and then down to the wire, tough ball game versus Buffalo, 240 pass yards and 2 touchdowns. So right here, Week 13, a good matchup versus Jacksonville, like I said. Give up the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And right here, Week 14 as well, he's home again as Goff. So he could be a quarterback you could use the next 2 weeks. And he's available right now in 54% of fantasy leagues. And this week's Kenny Pickett of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Kenny Pickett here, time of recording this, obviously, the Monday Night Football game didn't happen at the Indianapolis Colts. But Kenny Pickett's a rookie. You know, he's going to have up and downs. But he's a guy that has shown some flashes so far, and a guy who can run and has decent weapons in Najee Harris, George Pickens, and Deontay Johnson, and Pat Freiermuth in this offense. So the last few games here for Pickett, 191 pass yards and 37 rushing, and a fumble loss at Philly in Week 8. Week 10, after the bye week, 199 pass yards versus New Orleans, 51 rushing with a rushing touchdown. And Week 11 versus Cincinnati, 265 pass yards, a touchdown and 14 rushing. So right here, he's going to give you some yards on the ground, anywhere from 2 to 6 fantasy points on the ground is Pickett. And this Atlanta Falcon team here in Week 13 give up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So right now, Pickett available in tons of leagues at 89% and is a streaming option and decent quarterback if you're in a pinch. He's a guy we look to add this week. So on a quarterback I look to get this week on the wire is Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Rodgers, he left the ball game in Week 12 at the Philadelphia Eagles with a rib injury or oblique. And Jordan Love came in the 4th quarter and looked pretty decent. A lot of the throws were on target. He went for 113 pass yards and a touchdown. He had a good rapport with Christian Watson Alan Lazard on a couple plays. And right now, this pack of teams is most likely out of it this season here on the year. Not going to make the playoffs after losing 6 out of 7 ball games is Green Bay. Now, I think if Rodgers is banged up and they're out of it, they want to see what they got with the youngster Jordan Love, who they took in the first round in the 2020 draft. So right now, if he's the starter of Green Bay, he's got some mobility. He's got some decent weapons in Lazard, obviously. Christian Watson, Robert Tonyan, Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon out of the backfield, Randall Cobb as a slot receiver. And let's see what he's got. I think he could be a viable fantasy option, is Jordan Love. If he's going to get the opportunity, he's got a matchup week 13 in Chicago, and then they go on bye. So maybe if Rodgers is ready next week, they'll play him one more week, and then after the bye, Love will come in. But he's definitely a guy to keep in mind this week here on the wire, available in 100% of fantasy weeks. So that's a few quarterbacks I look to add on the waiver wire for week 13 of the fantasy football season.